One example is a mortician who we represented in a hospital. She works with cadavers, with corpses, and at one occasion she misgendered a cadaver. Apparently this individual, while they had been alive, had identified by a different pronoun. She had used the wrong pronoun and then was taken up on employment charges for being insensitive in this case. And we went in there and just said, hang on a second, guys, this is, sensitivity and cultural appropriateness aside, this is just taking it to an absurd degree.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Orpike. Joining me is the freedom fighter, the free speech champion, Jonathan Astro. Now, Astro, I assume you're well?
Yep, good.
Yep. Well, I spoke to you 5 minutes ago. I know you well. Let me run a hypothetical case study past you, okay?
Do it.
Let's say I'm teaching a body pump class in a gym somewhere. I greet everyone with a Happy Australia Day. Next, I sneeze, and the sneeze kind of sounds like the N-word. Unintentional, of course. The next thing I know, I'm being hounded online and called a right-wing bigot. Shortly thereafter, I'm fired. Who am I going to call?
Well, I don't know. Don't know who you should call because you said the N-word. So you should call Satan because you are clearly the devil. And I can't believe you'd say those things about black people.
Well, that's the wrong answer. I'm going to call the Free Speech Union.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, call them. They might get you out of a jam, but doesn't change the facts of what you said, is what I'm saying. Or maybe Jonathan, our guest today, Jonathan Ayling, can help me work through this confusion I have about whether I should chase you up to a windmill with pitchforks and torches or fight for your right to say things.
Before we bring on our guest, we need your help. We need you to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to the show. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about a show you liked or perhaps one that you didn't. Now, word of mouth is also a very powerful tool, so please tell all of your friends. And finally, to our Uber fans, if you love what we do, you can send us a little cash via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Any donation here is very much appreciated. Now, on with the show. Jonathan Ayling is the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union New Zealand, the first sister group of the UK group of the same name. Jonathan is here to talk to us about the organisation and the ongoing battle for free speech in New Zealand and the West more broadly. Jonathan, welcome to the New Flesh.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, I feel like the appropriate starting place is to ask, what is the Free Speech Union?
So the Free Speech Union is an advocacy group. We are actually in New Zealand a registered employment union. So we represent employees in disputes with their employers, especially around speech rights. But our work is much broader than that as well. So we do have formal membership. We can organise on employees' premises. But my background is in politics, working in Parliament here in New Zealand. So we work quite closely with members of Parliament and the Cabinet. We also work across universities in New Zealand. We have a content arm. We produce podcasts and documentary and op-eds and that kind of thing. So we have a number of different features that we're involved in. But really, our key goal is to promote and protect free expression in New Zealand. We're fiercely non-partisan, and so it's a lot of work really as the chief executive to work with my council, the board that I report to, being very diverse as it is ideologically. It can be a real effort to keep everyone together, but we think it's important that free speech not become a football that one side kicks around at the expense of the other, and so we think everyone has a stake in free speech. In New Zealand, of course, we're seeing attempts to undermine that, and as you say, across the West. So that's where we are really putting our boots on, stepping into the fight, and trying to educate and engage around this issue.
Well, broadly speaking, what kind of situations would I be in to be calling the Free Speech Union? When do I know it's time?
Yeah, I mean, for the employment cases that we represent, they're the sort of situations where they would be laughable if they weren't so serious, where if people's livelihoods were really not on the line. One example is a mortician who we represented in a hospital. She works with cadavers, with corpses, and at one occasion she misgendered a cadaver. Apparently this individual, while they had been alive, had identified by a different pronoun. She had used the wrong pronoun and then was taken up on employment charges for being insensitive in this case. And we went in there and just said, hang on a second, guys. This, sensitivity and cultural appropriateness aside, this is just taking it to an absurd degree. Another point would be just we represent a lot of individuals on social media cases where they make a comment in public, as it were, online, but distinct from their employer. But their employer feels like they have some sort of right to regulate that, or that because of there's maybe an association that they should have a say in what opinions they can hold. And really, during the 20th century, the union movement achieved this notion of the working day, that from 9 to 5, you do the bidding of your employer, but they don't own you for the rest of your time, that you are free to engage in political rallies or support different sports teams or whatever that may be. And the online digital age has encouraged employers really again to try and claim that which is not theirs. And so I would say we come up against a lot of bullies really, and what happens when you push against a bully? Usually they fall down. They're not used to having groups stand up with them resiliently with the law on their side. So we're very proud to say we haven't lost a single employment case. We go into bat for our members, and almost every time the employer backs down very quickly. And so I think that proves that while we are entering into an age of heightened intolerance, really there is a cultural bedrock, and there are laws that still advocate for basic employment rights.
Well, I'm going to ask you this several times today because this is where we've got vivid imaginations, and I would love to know what it's like. You take the mortician case, for instance, or something to that effect. What's it like when you contact them? Do you email them? Do you call them? And is there that moment where they go, what the hell even are you? Like, what is this? And then they've got to, I'm interested in that recognition that, because there's a certain climate today. It feels like, if you just take the company line, which is a certain set of values, you could pretty much say it anywhere, and that's all they had to worry about. Whereas you're coming in and you're saying, no, you actually need to adhere to a different set of values here. What are those situations like?
Look, when we contact employers, we try and be very collaborative and polite initially, at least, because we are very cognizant of the fact that people's employment is on the line here. Their livelihood is on the line. And there's a number of commentators, but Helen Joyce being a prominent one, who have recently been discussing the fact that to promote fear, one of the most effective ways to do that is to challenge people's livelihoods. And really, when we consider the culture of self-censorship that exists across the West nowadays, I would say cancel culture has really found its greatest strengths when it goes after people's ability to put food on their tables, to pay their mortgages. And so when we first engage, we don't want to rock the boat unnecessarily. But these employers aren't used to being challenged. They're not used to people saying no. And I would say that generally the state of censorship, the state of intolerance that we're engaging with in the West today comes from the fact that for several decades now, I think there's been a decline in the value of courage, in what it is to have some moral courage to stand up and to speak our minds, to say what we believe in. And so many employees self-censor excessively. And so the employers feel emboldened by that. So there is, hopefully it's not a perverse pleasure, but there is some sort of pleasure that I think our team gets when we go in there and we say, hang on a second, we know very well that the law is on our side. You are overstepping your mark here. And so we go in there and challenge them that. Usually they go, no, we're pretty sure. And at that point, we get involved in mediation or disputes. This is, of course, just one part of the work we do, but there have been a couple of fairly fiery exchanges, but that's what I think employees need. They need someone to stand in their corner with them, who is across the law, who's across the philosophical arguments of free speech. And so, sure, there's a price to pay for that, and we're only too pleased. It's actually the most rewarding part of the role that we do, I think, personally, is being able to stand with these people who have the courage to say, no, this is my belief. I will not simply concede your way of viewing things just because you're my employer. And so there is a courage, there is a strength that's required in that. And to stand with those people is a privilege.
Well, let's take a step back for a second, and because I've done a little bit of due diligence, and you are a bit of a man of mystery, and I like that. Would you mind giving us an insight into your background, perhaps?
So I grew up in Mozambique. My parents were humanitarian workers there who moved to Mozambique in the late 90s, and so that was the poorest country in the world at the time. Mozambique has quite a tragic past in terms of stepping out of its Portuguese colonial status in the 60s and kind of went almost straight into civil war all the way through to the 90s, and was really a part of the front of the Cold War between Russian-backed Communist Party, which was in government there, and then the West. And really, it was the West there. It was the United States principally, obviously, but actually New Zealand as well, which had supported rebel troops in Mozambique that were blowing up hospitals and schools and looking to destabilize the government there. So this was the context that I grew up in a country that in the 90s became democratic and really was only just starting to engage with what civil liberties or democratic freedoms would look like. And I think I have a very profound appreciation for what these liberties protect and what they enable in free societies. And so that was the context where I first started to believe very deeply in human rights and in civil liberties. I was educated in Kenya. We lived in Portugal for a while. I studied in France for a bit, but came back to New Zealand for university, and then worked in Parliament for a number of years, and then my wife and I purchased a vineyard out here in the sunny Wairarapa in a beautiful rural region in New Zealand, and I thought I was going to have quieter years tending my vines. My time in politics was over, and then I got called by the Free Speech Union, and the Minister of Justice in New Zealand in 2021 announced a consultation around hate speech laws, which was coming out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the horrific Christchurch attack that happened in 2019. And so they said, look, come and lead this campaign that we'll be running against hate speech laws for 6 weeks. And I thought I can do that for 6 weeks. We came on board. That was a real turning point for the Free Speech Union and bringing on a wider range of staff and professionalizing more. And 2 years later, and I'm still here. So something's clicked, and I've really found a passion and continual love to be working in this space. But I also think it speaks to this growing need. I wish I could do myself out of a job, but rather than over the past 2 years addressing the issues at play here, we actually find we're busier than ever, and there is more of a need than ever before, both in New Zealand and more broadly, to be defending this very basic notion. It's basic in one sense, but very profound, that our worst enemies should be given the right to express themselves, to speak. Those who we despise, those ideas that we hate the most, should actually be given the light of day. And certainly in our Western context, we refer to John Mill's work, and kind of he forms a real ideological basis for what free speech looks like within our Anglosphere context. But free speech has existed perennially across societies, and there is an absolute direct association and causation between the way that we treat the freedom of ideas and the prosperity of a nation. A Nobel Prize-winning economist has shown that no country that has free speech has ever experienced a famine. That famines only occur exclusively in countries that do not operate with regards to the freedom of their citizens or their subjects. And so it's interesting to look at a number of metrics like that and see the very real consequences of the really real implications of allowing free expression. And so that's something that has really caught my interest, and that's coupled with a fever that is gripping many Western nations right now, which is trying to suppress those that would oppose orthodoxies, and we have seen this time and time again throughout the West and other countries again, where free thought is suppressed, often with very good intentions. I would never seek to necessarily oppose the intentions of those that would come to introduce censorship or undermine free thought, but despite their good intentions, the implications are very severe.
And just on the political point, did free speech ever come up in your time in politics directly, or was this just deep in the background?
No, not explicitly. There have been a couple of awakening moments in New Zealand that have led to a growing concern around the state of free speech, and some of those events, foreign speakers being shut out of using venues, or a former leader of the opposition being cancelled on a university campus. These sort of issues occurred, and I looked at that and I thought, that doesn't seem right. Someone should do something. And then no one stepped up, and it was when these hate speech came along that I'm very convinced, a hate speech campaign that we ran for 2 years, which has ultimately been successful. I'm convinced that individuals would have gone to prison under that law in New Zealand in a very fairly immediate context. We're not talking decades down the line. If we had not effectively opposed those laws, that there is a cohort of individuals. I don't think by any means it's the majority or even a large minority, but there are a cohort of individuals in New Zealand, and I think it's comparable to other nations, who are intent on silencing those that would dare speak against their most cherished values. And I would never want to say that free speech is an easy notion. It's certainly not a comfortable one, but it is a fundamentally necessary one in order to ensure progress. And I can accept that for some individuals who feel their identities are challenged by free speech, or whose most fundamental cherished values are challenged by free speech, it is a very uncomfortable or offensive or disturbing even. I think offensive maybe even undermines the impact it can have. It can be a disturbing place to be, but the alternatives are far worse.
Well, perhaps you could talk us through a case study from real life and come at this from another angle. You mentioned that the hate speech laws. So I'm trying to understand the New Zealand government had designs on rushing through some hate speech laws fairly recently, and since the matter seems to be resolved for the moment, can you step us through this entire situation? I think it'd be instructive to see how a high-profile case like this goes, and maybe first start with what these hate speech laws were, who wanted them, and what did you do about it?
So to the context in New Zealand is that we have an MMP structure, which is different to Australia. So our parliamentary voting design is that we should never have a majority government. The system is designed to ensure that you have minority parties that are forced to go into coalition together, and that is what's called a centripetal force. It's supposed to enhance collaboration. In 2020, Jacinda Ardern, the leader of the Labour Party, was elected to a majority government for the first time ever under the system. And that was remarkable. It kind of broke the system. It wasn't supposed to work that way. So there was this incredible mandate behind this very empathetic leader that had remarkable communication skills and had led New Zealand over her period through a number of crises, including the attack in Christchurch on the mosque, where over 50 Muslim worshippers were killed in 2019, Whakaari White Island, through COVID, etc. So Jacinda Ardern had a real mandate in this case, and the Royal Commission of Inquiry, which was established to review what went wrong through the Christchurch attack, said that faith communities in particular did not feel that there was enough protection from speech against them. This is a red herring in many ways. The Minister of Justice that's currently in place has openly admitted that hate speech laws by no means would have stopped the attack in Christchurch. And also, it's a little bit of a red herring given the fact that the individual who conducted the attack was Australian and had actually only been in the country, as far as I recall, for several weeks. And so the fact that we then felt like we had to do this deep soul searching and change our legislative framework to address a problem that I don't think we had the right solutions, and I don't think it was really a problem that we had to address in that way. Nonetheless, there was a lot of support for these laws, and so the Minister of Justice at the time released a public consultation, and the proposals for the hate speech laws were going to drastically increase the scope of what was considered hate speech laws, the groups that were protected by hate speech laws, and the penalties for engaging in hate speech. Now, in New Zealand, we have had hate speech laws on the books for quite some time, but they have been used very, very sparingly. In fact, we've only had one prosecution under the current laws, and I think it's one prosecution prior in the preceding laws as well. So the judiciary has had a very conservative view on the way that they should engage against free expression. Our concern was that even if the legislative changes that are being put in place are not too excessive, it still signals a cultural change to the court that we want these laws to be applied more readily. And that means we could actually keep the same laws, but the judges use them more, and we could actually see free expression threatened through that. And so we began to coordinate across a wide variety of groups. And I think that was one of the keys to our success, was the fact that we didn't start banging the drum around just one interest group. Through the variety of people that sit around the council table for the Free Speech Union, we were able to access many different spokespeople and many different perspectives. And so we were able to harness a voice that was much harder for the Labour government to ignore than would otherwise have been the case if it was just the centre-right bloc that are currently in opposition in New Zealand. Certainly the National Party, which is the largest party in opposition, and the ACT Party, which is the party further to the right, made a lot of noise about the issue. Their voices mattered, and the opposition that they garnered through their people was part of the process. But it had to be bigger than that, and I think that is how we were successful in opposing this. And through that, we ended up facilitating the largest public consultation ever. Almost 20,000 people submitted on a policy proposal. It wasn't even draft legislation at that stage. And that was when we saw our first victory. The Minister of Justice in June 2021, where he released the proposal, said that these would be law by Christmas. And like so many other promises by Christmas, we were very pleased that he was unsuccessful in that, and we came into 2022. There's a confluence of issues that emerges here. In February, March 2022, New Zealand also had a very large protest emerge at our Parliament in Wellington, where up to over 1,000 people at some points came and camped on the grounds there for over 3 weeks, protesting a variety of issues, but principally the COVID mandates that had been put in place, where there had been effective mandatory vaccination in New Zealand. This highlighted division and polarization which was occurring in our society more than any other issue had prior to this. And so I'm not hesitant to say at all that played into concerns around hate speech and a reticence by the government generally to engage in really controversial legislation like hate speech laws. They decided, instead of proceeding with the wide variety of proposals that they had put forward, to simply make one change, and that was to include faith groups in the existing hate speech laws which we have on the books. So while they're not used frequently, our hate speech laws currently prohibit drawing into contempt individuals on the drawing into contempt groups on the basis of their nationality, on their ethnicity, on their colour, or their race. So these are immutable characteristics. They wanted to add religion into that. And our claim was that this is effectively blasphemy laws. In 2019, the Minister of Justice removed ancient blasphemy laws which we'd had on the books from many decades earlier that hadn't been used for some time, and we applauded that, saying in 2022 or 2023 Kiwis should not be threatened under law for blaspheming. But there's really no credible argument to be made that hate speech laws that protect religious expression, religious groups, aren't blasphemy laws. They are. It means if you challenge a cult and call it ridiculous, that you can be brought up on hate speech laws. This is very much operating in the same realm of affairs. And so while the government thought by paring back the proposals and the piece of legislation that they ended up releasing that they would succeed in, I guess, getting those that were standing up for free speech off their backs, we doubled down and said, this is simply absurd, and you're highlighting the danger around hate speech laws. And so then we continued to engage in this process, but it was at the beginning of this year when Jacinda Ardern resigned, and a key lieutenant of hers who had been with her since she first came into Parliament, Chris Hipkins, stepped into the role of Prime Minister. He decided that he was going to pare back many of the unpopular policies that she had been pursuing and get back to what he calls bread and butter policies. These are really basic cost of living issues that everyday Kiwis care about. And the fact of the matter is, no political analysis can tell you that the average Kiwi cares about hate speech laws, especially once any sort of counter-narrative is presented by an organisation like ours, showing that hate speech laws actually defends, first of all, the vulnerable or the minority rather than the powerful. Powerful people don't need free speech. They're powerful. It is the vulnerable and those that do not have access to power that are protected through free speech. And so at that point, Chris Hipkins removed the hate speech laws, which had already gone through several phases in Parliament. It was an unprecedented back down. And to save face, has put the legislation to the Law Commission to have advice going forward. I believe that if the Labour government is re-elected come October, when we're having another general election, we will probably have to have a fight around this again. But it's not going to be a cornerstone policy of a Chris Hipkins government like it was for his predecessor. So that's how we ended up coordinating quite a significant opposition to this, and really have been able to use this fight to make the arguments for free speech that are very important across the board. I certainly do not believe that Parliament is the primary advocate for censorship in our society. We have far bigger villains to be facing. The law is not the primary issue. The culture is the issue. Kiwis are suspicious at best or outright antagonistic at worst to the notion that obnoxious people should be able to say, quote, harmful things. And this idea that words are violence, that ideas themselves are harmful, is very pernicious, but it has been accepted by a host of Kiwis, especially younger Kiwis, especially university-educated Kiwis, who have gone through these, I would call them semi-elite channels, that have now developed this idea that free speech has helped marginalized groups in the past, but now is a weapon too dangerous to allow the average person to use. And so that is why we believe our work is more important than ever.
Now, you said something there. You said that words are violence, or that's not your view, obviously. But I'm interested in the definition of hate speech, because the left loves to play with words and they love to play with definitions. And I guess I'm interested in, if hate speech laws, were amped up, what would that threshold be, and would that move around as the left likes to play around with words and definitions?
That is the key question, and your answer is as good as mine. What is hate speech law? What is hate? Now, certainly my ambiguity around that question does not mean hate speech law does not. My ambiguity around that answer does not mean hate speech does not exist. And it doesn't mean that hate speech isn't harmful. Hate speech does exist, and hate speech is harmful, but it is not fitting for the government or Parliament to try and decide what that is. And so, certainly within society, there are ideas, there are views, there is expression that is corrosive to the values that we generally hold in a civil democratic society. Racism is enabled by free speech, and racism objectively and demonstrably harms our democratic societies. However, should we then empower the government to decide exactly what speech or what ideas or what expression is racist and what is not, and then what the penalties for that should be? This is becoming a very tricky-dicky type of affair. And Professor Nadine Strossen from the United States is really the preeminent commentator in the world on this issue, and she just repeatedly insists that there is no hate speech law which can be drafted, which cannot be manipulated to then impoverish or abuse the very people it was designed to protect. And again, we must remember that if we are trying to undermine if we are trying to undermine free speech in the name of protecting vulnerable minorities, what we are doing is creating the space where the powerful will retain speech, but the non-powerful won't. And this will then automatically it will start with, first of all, being used against those that it was designed to protect. And certainly in cases like in France and in Germany, two countries that, for different reasons, but both because of their experiences in the 20th century, have embraced this notion that some ideas should not be allowed to be expressed. We see there many cases where the individuals that are being brought up on hate speech charges, or what at least we would call hate speech law charges, are actually those that were supposed to be protected by these laws. Certainly Jewish communities in France, who are supposed to benefit from Holocaust denial laws and the like, are now silenced or fined or perhaps even imprisoned because of these laws. And so while we would never try and insist that... let me say that again, actually. While some may say that that free speech enables violent speech, we would not disagree at one level, that free speech does enable ideas that can be very harmful. But more than that, it is going to enable ideas that challenge harmful speech. And if we think we can simply suppress hate, if we think we can simply eliminate it from the public arena, that it somehow goes away, we are very, very naive, and we are very misguided. That in fact it suppresses it, it pushes into the darkness where it festers, and far worse atrocities or far worse consequences emerge from that. You know, a story that I think illustrates this is a comrade of Martin Luther King Jr., who was working with him in the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States. And he would go out leaf dropping houses in the South. And he said, if I come across a house with a Confederate flag in the window, I will cross to the other side of the street, because I know if I try and leaflet there, I run the chance of being lynched. But there were groups that were trying to outlaw displaying Confederate flags. And you know, we see iteration after iteration of this, outlawing use of the swastika or any other emblem that, yes, can represent incredible harm and periods of incredible turmoil in our society or in other societies. But it's a farcical, it is a childish view to think that because we can make hateful views quieter, that somehow we've addressed them. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's a very, very lazy approach. Professor Nadine Strossen, this preeminent professor on hate speech laws, wrote the book Hate, Why We Should Challenge It with Free Speech and Not with Censorship. The very notion of her work is challenging hate, is seeking to undermine the worst ideas in our society that do lead to division and violence. But we do it through exposing farcical, superficial ideas rather than giving them the dignity of being challenged through suppression. What happens far more frequently when we exercise hate speech laws specifically, or censorship generally, is actually we dignify our opponents and we make martyrs of them. And for, you know, if it is a Nazi who's speaking, the last thing I want to do is dignify their ideas. I would rather highlight how superficial and erroneous they are. And you can only do that through a society that believes in debate and the value of free expression. Unfortunately, across the West, we have become very timid in terms of what speaking freely and speaking courageously will mean. And certainly I accept that when we consider this, the structure of our history, that there are some voices that have been privileged more than others in the past. My solution to that is not to try and introduce tools to reduce free speech. It is to embrace free speech more and more. If there are voices that have been diminished in the past, let us embrace free speech all the more and elevate them to have equal participation in every conversation that they wish. Rather than trying to silence voices that speak loudly, let us ensure everyone can be part of the conversation.
Well, the phrase that comes to mind for me is sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I'm just interested to know why that idea is so out of favour now. How did that happen?
Very good question, and of course there are many answers to that across many different contexts. In New Zealand, I would say it has come from uh, a very progressive perspective that looks at life exclusively through power structures, and I don't think that is a particularly sophisticated or correct view to how societies function at large. But that's one answer in New Zealand. Across the West, especially across the Anglophonic West, I think we have to look at our histories with regards to settler societies and indigenous societies and the way that they have interacted or collaborated or not collaborated historically, and the roles that plays in our political structures today. Certainly, I don't want this to set anyone's ideological bingo off, but the Frankfurt School and Marxist ideology has a role to play in some parts as well at times in developing this notion that we should control and suppress certain forms of speech because it relates to disestablishing individualistic power structures and establishing power structures that are founded and orientated towards communitarian perspectives. And I would say that the notion of free speech is not a political one, but it does orientate itself towards individuals. Free speech is not about collective communities having a voice. It is about individuals having voices. It is about the agents of societies being individual actors who must be allowed to adhere to their conscience, to their own beliefs, and be allowed to verbalize those beliefs. That is what speech is. And so where we have societies that are increasingly orientating themselves towards identitarian or communitarian perspectives, that will run up against, at a certain point, free speech ideas. I want to be really careful there, though, because at the Free Speech Union and other free speech advocates around the world, we must work, as I've said, very hard to ensure that free speech doesn't become a centre-right or a far-right or a centre-left or far-left ideology. Of course, the left and the right have both used and abused free speech historically. If anything, the right has abused free speech more than the left has, which is then why it's such a historical anomaly and somewhat amusing that today free speech is perceived to be this centre-right or, again, perhaps far-right penchant, because this has occurred not even over the past decade. In less than a decade, we've seen this massive shift historically towards seeing free speech as a right issue. It is incorrect. It is incorrect today, and it is certainly incorrect historically. But many of the most prominent free speech advocates that we are privileged to work with are very much on the left. There are individuals that we work with that are very pro free speech, that dedicate themselves considerably to that, who identify as Marxists. Now, I look at that and I think there is some contradiction in terms there, but I'm glad to see that they have still orientated themselves towards this idea that the right to speak openly for individuals must be a given for any free society, and that is a given for any prosperous society. So why have we ended up here? I think that is the million-dollar question. I don't think we can effectively address that across every issue. We work across universities, academic freedom and free speech on campuses, both for student and for staff. We work in the media. We work across policies and political parties. We work with local governments. We work in employment. And I think in each of these different contexts, there are different causal factors that have accumulated across the West, and again, I would say especially across the Anglophonic West, that through various different avenues have arrived at this common place of saying that we need to be very suspicious of allowing individuals to speak too freely. And this has been a hallmark of every society that is orientating itself towards more authoritarianism and to orthodoxies, whether it is political orthodoxies or religious orthodoxies. For me, I've been very open about the fact that I'm a Christian. My faith is a defining part of my perspective, but I have to wrestle with the fact that the history of my faith has had horrifically authoritarian and oppressive tendencies, and I look at that as when the church has found itself in positions of increasing power, they have sought to retain that in a compulsive way, and that is an incredibly destructive tendency. That means that they have then suppressed the very ideals and the very values that they are called to uphold. And I would say equally with certain political regimes that have often started with good intent, or at least some good intent. Once they attain that position of power, they then want to retain it by suppressing anyone who would challenge that position, primarily through disseminating ideas that challenge theirs. And so orthodoxies emerge at many levels. And I don't think the term woke is a very helpful one, because there are as many definitions as there are people that use that word. But for the shorthand that it is worth, until there's a better word to use, I would say that woke ideology that increasingly finds itself orientating towards a very authoritarian perspective has come about because through the progressive shifts that have occurred in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we saw many minority groups use free speech to advance their cause. And it is a tragedy that it is at times those very groups now who are seeking, having come so far, to suppress those that would challenge any of their ideas. And it does not end well. It did not end well for the church in the Dark Ages to suppress ideas that challenged it. And the Enlightenment was this incredible rebirth that brought a far more open mind, and we've seen, of course, in many iterations of political regimes that orientate themselves towards this intense authoritarianism. It does not end well. Free speech, no matter who is using it. So yes, those that I disagree with and my opponents, even when they use free speech, still advance and increase their cause. I think there is an irony. I would say it's oxymoronic. This term that's emerged, I believe it was actually an Australian academic who first coined the term liberal authoritarianism to refer to political entities like Macron in France, or Justin Trudeau, or Jacinda Ardern as a prime example of individuals who have ostensibly embraced these incredibly progressive values, these incredibly liberal positions, but have sought to pursue them and to retain their position through very authoritarian means. And I contend that liberal authoritarianism is a oxymoron. You cannot embrace the ideas of liberalism, at least in any classical sense, that orientates itself towards the freedom of the individuals, creating free societies, if you are going to use the powers of the state particularly, but it's not just the state, the powers of large media networks or social platforms or employment positions to suppress those beneath you. That is a contradiction, and I don't think it's one that we should accept if we are going to continue to retain cultures and heritages that value democracy.
Now, I wanted to get your take on Jacinda Ardern's time as Prime Minister of New Zealand. And I remember seeing on social media a clip of when she announced her, I guess, departure from that role, her retirement from politics. And this was a pub somewhere in New Zealand. It looked like it was populated by maybe 100, maybe 200 people, and everyone cheered like they just went bananas when she announced this. And I'm just interested to know how she went from being the darling of the left internationally to seemingly, and I'm not sure if this particular clip is indicative of the entire country, but seemingly had this sort of a fall from grace in a way.
Well, the Free Speech Union is very intently non-political, and so for our work, we will orientate ourselves towards any individuals, whether they be political or not, that are going to collaborate and advance in genuinely advancing the freedom and the speech rights of all Kiwis and those beyond. With regards to Jacinda Ardern's ascent and then descent in many ways, there's no doubt that she had a historic and unique mandate. In 2020, she took Labour to an unprecedented victory in terms of the MMP system. No other party has achieved that, and I do think it was remarkable, and I think it will remain unique for some time. The context there is very relevant, though, and I think the the fact that we were in a COVID environment and that the insecurities of the world seem so pressing, that plays into it. Equally, not to become too nerdy, but the opposition at the time, the National Party, was very self-destructive, and that was relevant. How that then led to real opposition, I think we see across, again, the West primarily, and this is consistent with history as well, where leaders are elected to historic mandates in the height of crises. We think back to Churchill in World War II. Once the crisis disappears, they go, great, thank you for that, but we're probably ready for something fresh now as well. And so as a cost of living crisis begins to bite, as the economy slows down, as COVID seems less pressing, there is then very much an idea that, okay, we want to embrace something else. And so I don't know if it is fair to say that the popularity of the Prime Minister declined primarily because of authoritarian tendencies. I don't think that is true. I think average people care more about paying their mortgage and putting bread on the table, and the Labour government wasn't delivering that at the time, and that is why the incoming Prime Minister has orientated towards that so much. The clip that you're referring to there, I think probably speaks to a portion of New Zealand that has really opposed these progressive and then later on during COVID authoritarian tendencies. I don't know if that was the reaction that they had then. I don't know if they had ever been Labour voters. I don't know if they had ever supported her as Prime Minister. But nonetheless, it does indicate to a certain extent that for a portion of the population in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern resigning was comparable in a way to Margaret Thatcher losing. You know, she was a reviled character, as Margaret Thatcher was in the UK, but I guess by the opposite side. From the perspective of the Free Speech Union, though, we look at this with some concern because it speaks to the division and the polarization which is emerging in our society, where at one level a Prime Minister had been elected to a historic mandate, and yet there were people that so openly despised her. And of course, following her resignation, you probably saw as well, there was extensive coverage for about a week following her resignation, looking at the role of misogyny and the opposition that she faced as Prime Minister, what role that may have played in causing her to choose to resign. We saw that commentary as somewhat pernicious, looking at trying to blame people's means of expression as a way to invalidate the ideas that they held. And I think we see this consistently, that if you don't say it in the right way, if you don't articulate in ways that we appreciate, we can discredit your entire argument. And in reality, everyday people are probably not going to be very articulate or very concise or very adept at making soundbite comments, and we saw this at the protest of Parliament, where it turned into a very classist conflict, where the elites were looking at the rabble, the great unwashed. They're protesting having to have vaccinations, and there was a disdain for the plumber, or for the teacher, or for the farmer, who was not a comms expert and was not articulating themselves perhaps as clearly or concisely as they could. But we feel that nonetheless they should have a right to participate in public conversation and have their voice retained. And so I would say that Jacinda Ardern does have a legacy in New Zealand. It probably will take a few years to see exactly what that is. But unfortunately, I think undeniably part of that legacy will be an increase in polarization and division in our society that, while she has stepped down, remains. And that's what we're concerned about addressing.
Well, just before we leave Ardern there, She's not exactly a fan of free speech. I mean, she did make a speech at the United Nations where she declared misinformation and disinformation, which is just dissent in 2020's elite speak. She declared those as a modern weapon of war, and one that must be confronted by international leaders if they're to defeat fake news. Now, she stopped short of exactly saying how this should be done, but the message was pretty clear that the easily led masses can no longer be trusted, and it's time for the elites to take back control. I mean, how did you view that speech that she gave at the United Nations?
Again, it echoes this contempt, and you're touching on it exactly there, for the average person being able to have a view that dissents from elite orthodoxies. And I think I referenced at the beginning, we have these channels within society that are increasingly distinct from everyday people. And so while a lot of people look at the younger generation and say, oh, look, millennials or Gen Z don't agree with free speech, I say that's actually, you're looking at the wrong metric there. There are a lot of millennials or Gen Z that do believe in free speech, but more and more millennials and Gen Z have gone through universities than previous generations. And so I think going through university is perhaps the feature we need to look at there. And these are contexts that are creating culture, and I would say Jacinda Ardern is tapping into that, and very much with regards to the speech at the United Nations, playing into this belief that of course free speech is important, of course we have to care about free speech. You say Jacinda Ardern doesn't believe in free speech, of course she believes in free speech, but it's about misinformation, it's about disinformation. Hate speech is not free speech, and it's these tropes that are really very meaningless. Hate speech is not free speech. What does that even mean? You challenge someone. It's oft repeated, but you challenge someone to define what that means, and again, you'll get as many answers as you do people that you ask. You say misinformation or disinformation are simply shorthand for dissent nowadays. At one level, we would agree that misinformation is a problem. If a wide host of a society believes in things that are factually incorrect, that is a problem. And it's a problem that needs to be countered. But the way it's challenged, previously, society believed in facts that were not correct. They believed the earth was flat. The way to challenge that was by allowing scientists to prove it was, in fact, not flat, or, that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa, by allowing these debates to emerge. And so there are real consequences for whether it's information around health access or about, you look at in the United States around stolen elections or whatever, these incredible narratives that emerge. Who can say which is true? Who can say what the real story is? Certainly not the government. They're the last people I think we should be trusting to control that information. And so free speech never predetermines the outcome that emerges there. It simply allows the debate to happen. And that's very inconvenient if you are so certain that you are right and you are so morally virtuous that you should not be opposed. And I think the narrative around, if any phrase that Jacinda Ardern is known for, it's probably be kind. I would say that kindness is an incredible attribute to aspire to. But if kindness is built on falsehood and not on truth, it becomes very, very cruel. And the only way we can actually find out what is true is through debate and through allowing errors to come to the surface and be discarded. And there's no given that societies, once errors come to the surface, will choose truth. Certainly we've seen societies that nonetheless have chosen to pursue errors. But at least they do so a little bit more with their eyes wide open then, and they're not being led away under false narratives to the same extent.
So, just generally speaking, Jonathan, what are the biggest taboos that are on the horizon for you at the Free Speech Union in New Zealand?
We talk about sacred cows, and there are, in New Zealand at the moment, principally 3 sacred cows. Unfortunately, the list is far longer than that, but there are 3 in particular that you risk your employment status, you risk your social standing, you risk your academic potential if you dare consistently voice perspectives counter to them. And they won't surprise you, because I think they are somewhat consistent with a general cultural milieu that exists currently across, again, specifically the Anglophonic West. They would be transgender rights as opposed to women's rights, and the debate around gender-critical perspectives, around race relations, Indigenous societies in New Zealand, that takes the context specifically around the Treaty of Waitangi and what that means within our society, what it meant 150 years or 170 years ago, and what it means today. And thirdly, climate change. I guess at one level for some whether it exists, but for many others what its existence means, and again how we should effectively counter it. If on any of these issues, a senior lecturer at a university or a council worker or a ministry bureaucrat voice opinions that dissent from the orthodoxies that we all kind of stand in a row to articulate in time, we've seen many of them face incredible social and again, economic and employment consequences for that. If I have time, I'll develop a slightly long-winded example of this. We represented 7 prominent scientists in New Zealand, or academics, that wrote a letter claiming that what's called mātauranga Māori, which is kind of the Māori body of knowledge, the Māori way of viewing the world and understanding reality, that mātauranga Māori is not the same as science. These were 7, among them were 7 of the most prominent scientists in New Zealand, fellows of the Royal Society and professors that had spent decades training medical students or others involved in science through New Zealand universities. And they said that Mātauranga Māori has an incredible place in New Zealand culture and in our body of knowledge. It is very relevant and must be honoured within that. But it is not the same thing as science. And that when we talk about Mātauranga Māori as opposed to what is considered Western science, they said we committed an incredible error, because there's no such thing as Western science or Chinese science or Māori science. There is simply science. It is a means, it is not an end, it is a process by which we get to assess the physical world around us. And these 7 academics, what are now called the Listener 7, because they wrote a letter in the Listener magazine, a weekly magazine here, that challenged the New Zealand science curriculum that was going to teach, and now teaches, that rocks have a life form, that they have an energy, because this is what Mātauranga Māori teaches. And these scientists, including among them a number of Māori, were absolutely castigated for daring to voice the opinion that Mātauranga Māori is not the same thing as science. A number of them were threatened with expulsion from the Royal Society, and that's where we got involved, and we said it is entirely antithetical, absolutely, to the role of science and academies that are dedicated to advancing science to expel members for simply voicing contentions and beliefs that oppose the cultural orthodoxies of the day. And that was an incredible fight, a very prominent one that ended up getting individuals like Professor Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne from the University of Chicago, a very prominent scientist, Jordan Peterson, all got involved. Elon Musk, in fact, even recently tweeted about this affair. And it illustrates the religious blindedness, really, I think, is the only way to view it. There are very pseudo-religious tones to many of these orthodoxies that prevail. This blindedness to any sort of view that science is fundamentally undermined, the potential to progress in science is undermined if contentious views that oppose the status quo cannot be openly voiced and assessed on their merits. And the point was that this perspective was not being challenged on its merits. No one was trying to debate and substantiate the claim that no, Mātauranga Māori is the same thing as science. They simply were saying you shouldn't say that. And that was the tenor or the level of debate that was just so cursory, so farcical. And I think this shows the stakes for even very prominent, very successful people who, in this case, speaking in the context of race relations or indigenous knowledge, dared defy our, and that this may be overstating it slightly, but our ideological overlords. But you will be aware as well of the example of Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keen Minshall, who in I'm losing track of my months now. I believe it was in March. Visited New Zealand and was literally run out of the country by a baying violent mob. It was a very shameful day, I think, for New Zealand, not because we didn't embrace her ideas. That's not what I'm advocating for. It was because we don't really know what her ideas were because none of us got to hear them. that there was a baying mob that just absolutely surrounded her. It's remarkable that there weren't more serious injuries that day, and there were a number of fairly serious injuries, but people could have been seriously hurt because of the fever of that mob mentality that took hold, that insisted that no idea counter to theirs could be expressed, could hear the light, could be exposed. And so I think, again, across these issues, Kiwis are seeing several examples of issues where maybe they don't agree with the people that are trying to speak, but they at least accept that they should be able to have their say. And I think that's why I perhaps this is overly optimistic, but I dare hope that we're reaching an inflection point in free speech generally across the West, if perhaps not exclusively in New Zealand at this stage, where individuals are waking up to the states and saying, unless we speak up for free speech now, it's a hard right to fight for once you've lost it. And so that's why I think we're at a pretty crucial point in terms of where we are in New Zealand, where we are in the Anglophonic West, where we're in the West generally. If over the next 2 or 3 years we don't take this seriously, I think we may have gone too far.
Now, those taboos you mentioned, those speech taboos that are taking place in New Zealand, we have a very similar situation here in Australia. I mean, we even have our own sort of Indigenous situation and sort of contested ideas around certain things to do with our Indigenous population that are taboo to talk about as well. Is there a chapter of the Free Speech Union coming to Australia? Because I feel like we're going to need some help.
I wish I had better news to announce. There certainly have been individuals that express interest in continuing work similar to ours there, and if there were individuals on the ground wanting to raise the standard for free speech, we would be in behind them in a flash. Not that I'm aware of at this stage. As I say, there have been individuals who have expressed interest, but nothing has come of that at this stage. It's interesting you raise this question because it has caused me to, with my team, kind of go, well, do the Kiwis need to come and show the Aussies how it's done again? You know, do we need to set up? Do we need to take this bull by the horns and come and set something up there? I don't think we have capacity for that at this stage. But certainly we look at our cousins across the ditch and we see many of the similar issues. Unfortunately, as far as we can tell at this stage, there isn't a similar organisation to rally around that is for everyone, that is for anyone who will simply stand for free speech. And I think that is what is needed. Of course there are think tanks and of course there are political parties that are speaking out about free speech, but it takes such a partisan tone that it can actually at times be more harmful or it can be counterproductive. And so what is needed is this very, of course it's a misquote to claim Voltaire said the famous phrase, if I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say that was written by his by Beatrice Hall, his autobiographer. But the point is a very poignant one, and what I think is necessary in that is for us to recognise that we can't distract the issue with all these other politics associated with it. That does an incredible disservice. And so I hope that there will be those in Australia who can reach across the aisle, sit around a table, and agree to disagree on, the council I report to couldn't agree on where to go to for lunch, let alone any of these other substantial issues that we have to face weekly. You have to agree to put everything else aside, other than the fact that free speech is the way we will ultimately see who's right. And I take great pleasure, because of course I'm right. Of course I am. And so I take great pleasure in the idea that ultimately I will be proven right. But I think I have a suspicion those that disagree with me think they're right as well. And so that's where free speech is a very humble enterprise. It actually, rather than insisting that I'm right, presupposes that I don't understand everything, that I do have more to learn, that while I may be 99% of the way there, my greatest opponent may have 1% still to teach me. And I think in many ways what we see is an incredible intellectual and cultural hubris emerge from those that oppose free speech. And I would say a meekness and a humility emerging from those that accept that free speech is necessary to reveal their own error, which inevitably exists at some level.
Just perhaps one final question, Jonathan. Some of our listeners have heard all this and they might be saying, geez, engaging an outside body to deal with my problem at work or whatever sounds a bit hectic, as we would say here. And I think they're probably thinking, I might just see if this whole thing blows over. What advice would you give them?
Don't give in to bullies. No issue that I can think of is improved by ignoring it. And we have a cancer in certainly in our Western society at the moment that is insisting that some ideas simply must be silenced. They mustn't. It's not that they should be counted. It is that they should be suppressed. And it is fundamentally corrosive to our most basic values in democratic societies. It threatens every single one of the civil liberties or the human rights that we hold dear. And that's because free speech is the foundation. It is the freedom of thought, which is the essence of humanity, to be able to live freely. And so I would say my constant encouragement to anyone who will listen to me is we must reflect on the self-censorship that we engage in. And I think self-censorship is the great problem that no one is talking about in our society. The number of issues, the number of incredibly unique thoughts, incredible solutions that are never discovered because we don't voice them because of self-censorship. We are afraid of speaking out against the orthodoxies. We have a belief, we hold it inside, but we know we're not supposed to say that. And if we do not stand true to free speech, actually, before long, our ideas will change. We will come in line with the very ideas that we initially disagreed with because we never stood to counter them. So I would say to your listeners, don't self-censor. Now, that doesn't mean be obnoxious. It doesn't mean you have to bang your fist on the table and voice your opinion at every chance you get. But don't say things you believe are not true. And if I may, I'll just illustrate this with a point, an example of a case we dealt with here recently. There was a radio broadcaster, quite a prominent primetime radio host, who was told to say pregnant people. And she was laughing about this with her co-host on air, saying, pregnant people. They're not pregnant people, they're pregnant women. And she said, this is the sort of thing that I would be willing to lose my job over. I'm not going to say pregnant people. And when I listened to that day, I thought, good on her. The next day, though, she came on air and she said, I just want to apologize for the incredible harm that I...
The hostage video.
Sorry?
Yeah. She did the hostage video.
That's right. And you can't make this stuff up. She said, I am going to go off for re-education because it's almost this very Stalinist way of framing the ideas that they're just completely ignorant to. And I said, shame on her. I then spoke with some of the people involved in our work, and they said, well, she would lose her job. You got to feel for her. She's got a mortgage to pay. And I said, shame on her, because you don't say things that you don't believe are true. And I said, she's not a single mum working at a supermarket. If she had been fired, first of all, the Free Speech Union would have been there in a flash to defend her right and get her a pretty handsome payment. But secondly, she would have bounced. She would have landed somewhere else. But don't say things that aren't true. So your listeners simply must not self-censor and say things that they know are not correct. But I would also say that if you think that... conceding today is going to win you anything tomorrow, you're wrong. Think about also those that surround you. I'm a real big believer that stiffened spines stiffen spines. That you see the courage of one person stand up in a workplace or stand up against an ideology that many people do not accept, and that courage enables the courage of others. So if you are that person who goes, that's right, I haven't been self-censoring, but I don't want to take it too far, stand in courage, and you will actually see that other people are inspired by that around you. And this can sound very noble and maybe a little bit cliche. I want to avoid being too grandiose about this, but there is a reality, and we were talking about this again, a spirit that Kiwis share with Australians last week as we celebrated Anzac Day. The reality is that there are you can distill the ideas of authoritarian regimes to a handful of tendencies. And certainly I don't want to say that all authoritarian regimes are the same. They're not. But there are tendencies that emerge that are virtually ubiquitous. And the attempt to control what people believe is primary amongst those. You cannot be a dictator. You cannot be a dictator for very long, at least, unless you try and control what people believe, what people hear, and what people say. And the Anzac spirit is very much dedicated to this idea that there are basic democratic liberties that, in the Anglophonic Western tradition, we are very, very blessed to have inherited. And so I don't want to abuse that spirit. I want us to genuinely honor it and go, if we do not stand for this today, the stakes are high. Again, I don't want to catastrophize, but the reality is, unless we stand for freedom through political process and through activism and through using the law today, the alternative, there is only one. It is violence. The reality is every single society that does not allow individuals to speak freely is condemned to violence. And New Zealand and Australia are no exceptions to that. I assume it's similar in Australia. Certainly in New Zealand, we can have a very arrogant, exceptionalist view of ourselves. We were the first country to give women the right to vote. We were a country that never enslaved our indigenous population. We were a country that had Māori representation from early, blah, 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 blah. Wonderful. I'm glad that we didn't make all the mistakes that other countries made. But that doesn't mean we are incapable of making mistakes going forward. And I believe that we have an election coming up in October. The Free Speech Union echoes the concerns of the police and the security services and other senior figures that we are concerned there could be violence this election, unlike that which we've seen in the past. And you look in the UK, where several politicians have been killed over the past decade in violent attacks. Is all of this to blame because of free speech? Not directly, but it certainly relates to a belief in a culture and society that says if you say something, if you believe something, if you express something, if you embolden something, I can attack you. I can oppose you violently. And that is the thing. Free speech does not enable violent tendencies. It is the opposite of violence. It is the insistence that violence should never prevail, that opposition should occur through words and through ideas. And so those are the stakes. That's the rules of the game. I wish it wasn't so. But unless we get to grips with this now, our societies will be condemned to be more violent. And every person, no matter where you come from, on a political spectrum, on an economic spectrum, or what race you are, every person should care about that.
Well, before we wrap things up here, Jonathan, perhaps you can tell us, well, first of all, can anyone join the Free Speech Union, and how do they join?
Non-citizens can become supporters of the Free Speech Union, but they can't become members. But we welcome your support and the engagement and the resources and advice that we can offer you. So if you go onto our website, fsu.nz, you'll find resources there, and I suggest that you subscribe. The primary way that we stay in touch with our base is through regular emails that will cover a variety of issues that we're working on. We'll provide you with resources and really engaging material. We've recently released a documentary film that has been well received across the country, and I think many of your listeners would enjoy that as well. We also produce a podcast and various other resources as well. So if you go to fsu.nz/subscribe, you can sign up there. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, where we are quite active, and again, looking to educate and enable others to have the courage and the capacity to stand up for free speech.
Well, Jonathan, you've got to set up a chapter here, mate. I mean, you're going to feel so bad when we get cancelled, and you would have had. It's that old quote. You would have sat by and watched it happen as Ricky loses his job, and God knows what happens to me. So anyway, I'll just leave you with that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk to my team. We're going to get an expeditionary force ready from the Antipodes to come over to Australia.
Well, thank you for being so generous with your time, Jonathan, and we definitely want to have you come back because I suspect this issue is ongoing.
Unfortunately, yes. But hey, look, appreciate your time, guys. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.